Okay. I'm just watching this.
All right, everyone, it is 6 o'clock on the dot, and I do want to make sure that we start on time and end on time. So I'll give a brief introductory slide, which is welcome. This is the Disability Justice in STEM webinar, the first webinar of 4, and this one is on the basics. Before we get started, I do want to give a little bit of a land acknowledgement. We take this opportunity to acknowledge that the University of Rochester, from where this webinar is being broadcast, is on stolen land. We acknowledge with respect that the land upon the university sits is that of the Seneca Nation, known as the Great Hill People and keepers of the Western Door. The culture of colonialism is ongoing, and we must work to acknowledge the ways in which we take part. With that being said, I will start to introduce myself. My name is Sarah Bross. My pronouns are they, them, and she, her. To give a visual description for some of the people who might have low vision, I am a Caucasian white female who is also non-binary and can kind of go between female and non-binary. I have braids. I am wearing a maroon shirt. My background includes metal ceilings, white walls, and a cabinet in the background. I am from University of Rochester. I am an upcoming senior, and I am the iGEM Science Manager. If Thomas, my co-presenter, could now introduce himself.
Hello, everybody. Wonderful introduction as always, Sarah. I hope you're having a good day whatever part of the world or time zone you might be in at the current moment. Welcome. I am Thomas Ledbetter. My pronouns are he, his. To give a visual description of myself, I have shoulder length, dirty blonde hair. I'm a Caucasian white male, Caucasian white single. And I am in a lime green room at the current moment with a white, not white, yellow. Wow, colors. I have a yellow polo on. I was not expecting to do descriptions, but this is good to know. I have a yellow polo on at the current moment, and I am an alum of the University of Rochester, both at the Warner School of Education. I recently graduated with my master's degree in the Human Development program with a specialization in developmental differences. It's so nice to be able to say that now, having an MS. But I'm also an alum of the U of R psychology, as well as the brain cognitive science program at the University of Rochester. And most importantly for this case, I'm an autistic self-advocate, and most of my expertise in what I've done both at Warner and at the U of R proper is related to autism and advocacy in multiple different areas. So welcome, and thank you for having me here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Thomas. And just to give a little bit background as to why I am presenting, thank you, Thomas, for introducing yourself as autistic. And I am also autistic. I also have a dissociative disorder, which means I can't remember anything past today. So I can't remember yesterday. I can't remember anything really past yesterday. All of my memory is kind of foggy. So that kind of fits into the realm of disability, as well as a currently undiagnosed heart condition, which we're trying to figure out. So I have a couple of different disabilities and they all kind of fit in, which is why I feel comfortable talking on behalf of this disabled community tonight. So we'll jump right in. The first thing I wanted to kind of talk about is called the Leaky STEM pipeline. Leaky because not all of the people who originally plan on studying STEM make it to the end, specifically with disabilities. As you can see on the left side of the screen here, there's a 12.2% that is connected to the years 6 to 14 years old. And that represents the percentage of students 6 to 14 years old who identify as being disabled or have formally gotten accommodations. Of course, that doesn't represent all of the people who are disabled, because not everyone has the privilege of receiving accommodations and getting a formal diagnosis, which will allow you to get those accommodations. By the time we get to the undergraduate stage, this is specific to people who are studying STEM. So about 10% of undergraduates who are studying STEM are disabled. Once we get to the graduate phase, where people are getting a master's or a PhD, that number drops to 6% of folks who are disabled are studying STEM. And finally, we get to 2% of PhD recipients are disabled. So somewhere along the way, we have made it from 12.2% all the way to 2%, meaning that this pipeline is rather leaky.
What is interesting and difficult about this sort of idea is that there are multiple factors. And while my area is not specifically in STEM, I can speak to the general idea, looking at people with disabilities and saying, you know, they might have an idea of what they want to do in terms of STEM, in what their field is, in what their passions are. But for a lot of reasons, unfortunately, people end up kind of getting lost in the shuffle in that and are either demotivated to do STEM or are not given the proper resources to allow them to move in. From the experience I've had just moving into the psychology field, I can see similar things where, for instance, for autistic people, for example, there are a lot of stereotypes related to going into certain fields. Now, granted, math and physics, which is stereotypically what people think that autistic people are good at, is something that is within STEM. But let's say someone wants to specialize in a different area and someone might think they might be better at this, that might discourage them to get into a specific area. Or more, I think, aptly, a lot of autistic people have difficulties because of lack of accommodations that help with employment and difficulties with trying to get access to internships, things of that nature. And so you're going to have a lot of people who may not be given the accommodations that help them do well in those situations. And then they attribute that to their own abilities as thinking, oh, I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough in what I do. And then they're just like, I'm not cut out for this, I don't want to do this. When if they were given the right accommodations in the first place, they would probably be better off. And so that kind of ends up resulting in this leaky pipeline where the farther and farther you go, the more specialized skills that are needed and required. And unfortunately, the accommodations to be able to bring out those skills in a way that's to the person with a disability and the things that they are able to do, the things that they might be proficient at if given the right resources, are not able to come about. I even think about this in the way that we talk about what does it mean to be smart, because we talk about intelligence in, mathematics and vocabulary and verbal skills, but what if someone isn't as verbal? And what if given the right resources, maybe they might be able to express their thoughts and ideas, but they may not just do it through the same way. We might think of as smart as being, good again with calculations, good at organization in certain ways, and they might do, might not be as quote unquote good as that, but they might be better at problem solving, thinking outside the box in certain ways and coming up with connections that other people might not. And so because we define smart in a very specific way for these fields, that can also make people think I'm not cut out for this when maybe they might be. And even just the vocabulary that we use, that we talk through things like you have to talk like a scientist, you have to use a specific vernacular, a specific idea. And for social diagnoses like autism, we might express ourselves differently. We might have different ways of going about problem solving or different ways of expressing. But because of this idea of you have to talk like us and be an insider in the field, that pushes people that much further out. And so it's a combination of lack of resources and supports and just the general stigma that comes with having a disability, which then leads to more and more people getting discouraged to get into it, or even more extremely being pushed out of it.
Thank you. And I do want to add that, like, when I was growing up, a lot of things in my high school were saying, a lot of people in my high school were saying, well, I can't be a scientist because they're really smart. Scientists are smart. And scientists have that stereotype of they have to be smart people. And when we define people with learning disabilities as maybe not as smart, because our definition of IQ is based on a very specific definition of smart, like I'm good at reading books, that means I'm smart. I'm good at doing math, that means I'm smart. And when you might have a disability in learning math, or you might have a disability in reading, do you no longer fit the definition that society gives being smart, and therefore can you not be a scientist?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Great one on that, Sarah.
So some other data that we have to kind of get you interested in this is the increase of minorities in STEM. Here we see that there's been a very slow increase overall in Hispanic and Black populations, which is good, but again, it's very small. I do want to acknowledge that. However, this very small percentage of increase is further amplified within the disabled population, as well as the population of Native Americans or Indigenous peoples. So although there has been a lot of kind of effort, I would say, lately in trying to increase minority representation in science, we're not necessarily seeing the same effects for all groups of minorities, specifically for disabilities. Yeah. So how can we improve these statistics? The number one thing is, first, you have to understand the disabled community. You've got to know the basics before diving into anything further. You have to know just general terminology, which we'll go into today. The second step is understand the experiences of the disabled community. This is emphasized greatly because if you don't understand the specific experiences of what the disabled community is going through, what they want, what they don't want, you're just an able-bodied person who's speaking on behalf of disabled folks, which is not necessarily what we want. We want kind of, or at least what I want as a representative of the disabled community, is for people to talk to me and then reflect my experiences back to the rest of the community. And finally, the third step is then you can focus on accessibility. Once you've understood those two first points, you can then focus on accessibility.
If I can interject just quickly with that, with the experiences of the disabled community, I think what is really important to acknowledge is that each person in any given community, because of the way that identities will intersect, that you will obviously, people with disabilities can intersect with many other minority communities, racially, gender-wise, sexuality, many different things. And so trying to understand what someone wants is important in looking not just from a policy standpoint, saying, what does this larger community want, but looking at the individuals in front of you when you're working with them, because they may not want all the same things that the community themselves want and may have different accommodations. And so as much of a general rule as it might be, I think a really important thing is not just understanding and asking, but really listening to the experiences of the person in front of you that you're working with and taking their word for what they're saying, rather than devaluing or dismissing or worrying about qualifying what they're saying, because that doesn't help them get the things that they need to do well in what they want to do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So just a general agenda, because for some people, going through a large PowerPoint might be a little bit confusing with processing issues. I know myself, I like to have a general agenda of what we're going to be talking about. So the first thing we'll be talking about is the social model of disability and comparing that to the medical model. The second thing we will be talking about is addressing the disabled community. The third thing we'll be doing is talking about ableism, our own experiences of ableism and general ableism within the community, especially within STEM. And the third thing will be a Q&A. So let's define disability. I know it sounds rather simple, but I promise it'll get a little bit more difficult. So what does Merriam-Webster say? Merriam-Webster defines disability as being impaired or limited by a physical, mental, cognitive, or developmental condition. Seems like a pretty basic definition that most of the time we might agree with. However, let's dive a little bit deeper. What about eyesight that can be fixed by glasses? We're not talking about folks who are low vision or might be blind. We're talking about folks who can see with eyeglasses. Technically, if you're thinking back to the definition I gave on the previous slide, this is an impairment in a physical condition. Therefore, is it a disability? Why or why not? So overall, what I would say is it is not, because society has fully accommodated those who wear glasses. If you think about it, those who wear glasses just put on their glasses and then they can see. Therefore, society has fully accommodated them and they're not disabled. Now, I want to highlight the part here that says society has fully accommodated. If society had not fully accommodated those with glasses, it would not be a disability. So the clear difference here of what is turning something into a disability or not making it a disability is society. So there's an alternative definition in which disability is defined as a person is disabled when they are limited in some way, shape, or form from fully engaging with society as a whole. Again, emphasizing the part of society. This brings us to the medical model of disability and the social model of disability. While the medical model of disability defines disability as impaired or limited by a physical, mental, cognitive, or developmental condition, so that's limited by your body or how your body works. The social model of disability defines it as impaired or limited by society. So how does society limit you? You're limited by society. To give you an example, take someone who is in a wheelchair. Let's say they have a meeting to get to on the 4th floor. Is it their body that's prohibiting them from getting to the 4th floor of the building? Or is it society that didn't build an elevator to the 4th floor of the building? It's an interesting question.
In terms of just as sort of an example of this, we can then use autism as an analogy for this, and because it fits in perfectly with these ideas. And so we get to this question of, to use as an example, how does autism fit into the medical and social models? Now, autism is a really interesting has a place in this that's sort of difficult to define, because it sits in a no man's land between what people would call a developmental disability and neurological condition, mental illness, and on the other end seeming as a neurological difference. Now, there's been a lot of debate regarding which interpretation is considered the correct interpretation of autism, but I think what is complicated about that is that there really isn't an interpretation that's exactly falling into that line. And that is something that a movement known as neurodiversity emphasizes. Neurodiversity, in a summary, basically is the idea that in terms of the entirety of human beings, all of the developmental differences that we have neurologically, the way our brains operate, the way we process information, social cues, all of those things are all variations on the human condition. And it's sort of like a bell curve where a lot of people fall into this sort of category in the middle where there are more similarities towards people, but those differences still exist between how people process cues, individual differences. But among these sort of smaller parts of the bell curve, there are less people, but there are more stark differences. And that's where autism tends to fall, where the differences in processing social cues, differences in processing sensory aspects of the world, processing just general information are all very different. But those things are just as valid as any other, as long as the accommodations for those things are given. And that's, I think, the key, where it falls into a social model of disability because it is not, this is the condition of being autistic, of the difficulties in processing social cues that I'm putting in air quotes, so the difficulties with changes in routine or sensory things that are disabling. It's the lack of accommodations to understand those things. And so if, let's say, Sarah and I were to be given the accommodations we need socially, emotionally, functionally to be able to do the things we do, then the best parts of our social differences could be able to come out, whether it be the way we communicate uniquely with other people, the way that we perspective take that might be different, the ways that we process social cues and social norms differently that are really important and valuable in our own lives, and just the nature of having it as an identity and being happy about existing as true to ourselves is all really important. Now, one might argue that that this may only include people who have low support needs, like, for instance, myself, because I'm very verbal, I've gotten a master's degree, But I think this is kind of erroneous, because if people, let's say, who were nonverbal were able to be given resources like text-to-speech apps, visual boards where they can be able to point to words and letters, things like ASL or other sign languages, given those resources, they could be able to communicate just as effectively as I, Sarah, or any other autistic person who has lower support needs might have. And so to just be able to confine it to one part of the spectrum or not doesn't capture the whole point of neurodiversity, which is everyone on that spectrum is valid. And at the end of the day, autism is a natural variation of how we process things rather than a disability to be fixed or cured or seen as other that should be sort of dismantled. Do you have any thoughts on that, Sarah?
I completely agree. Thank you so much for saying all of that.
You're welcome. If anyone, by the way, if anyone thinks I talk too fast, please let me know and I will slow down.
So jumping back into our general agenda, we've concluded the social model of disability, and now we are going to move into addressing the disabled community, which Thomas, well, I'll start off and then Thomas will kind of continue. So the first kind of rule that we want to talk about when we're addressing the disabled community is that disability is not a bad word. It is just as neutral as anything else. Also important is that disability can be part of one's identity, similar to race, ethnicity, and sexuality. It is equivalent to say, I am disabled, as it is to say, I am pansexual, or I am white. It's just a descriptor that is completely neutral. It can also be a point of pride, where I might feel proud of my disabilities, and I might feel proud of the way that I move about this world, despite society kind of oppressing the disabled community. And some final notes on how to address the disabled community is we tend to want to avoid euphemisms, such as disability with the letter A capitalized, challenged, or differently abled. Those are all euphemisms that people tend to use because they're uncomfortable with the word disability in the first place. Again, disability is not a bad word, and using those euphemisms kind of indicates that it is a bad word, or that you're trying to put a positive spin on disability when it's not negative in the first place. So again, just use the word disability and definitely try to avoid those euphemisms, but that's just my opinion. Thomas will try and take it over from here.
To sort of bring these ideas of how we frame disability and our perceptions around disability back home, we want to look at a case study here from an individual. His name is Jason McEwen, but he is more popularly known as JMac. And this was back in, I believe, 2003, but a lot of the points here are still very relevant today, and many things talking about, I think, are important to think through here. But JMac, just as a quick summary, he was an autistic high schooler at the time of this, and was importantly on the basketball team. He was actually born in Rochester, and I think played games in the sort of general area. I think Greece, I believe, for those who are more familiar with the Rochester area. So he played games there in high school on his basketball team, and there was a big news story about him that came up at the time that Sarah and I are going to play for you for a bit. I don't know if the audio is working on the video.
I can hear it.
I don't think I can on my end.
Okay, we can describe the video.
Okay, cool.
So it starts off where there is a narrator that is saying, with 4 minutes and 19 minutes left, 4 minutes and 19 seconds left in the game, they called JMac, or Jason McEwen, onto the court. He then proceeded to score 20 baskets within those just 4 minutes. And there are a bunch of interviews afterwards where the coach is kind of being interviewed, and the coach is saying, you know, it was a miracle, and it was just magic, and I started crying, and it's really like kind of a heartwarming story that you would see on like CBS Sunday Morning or something like that, like your Sunday morning news that you would want to see kind of heartwarming things on, is the best way I could describe it.
And with 4.
So we're going to skip this part because you didn't actually get to see the video. And Thomas, you're muted, by the way.
Thank you. What I think is interesting about this kind of story is there are always going to be sort of different sides and different places to look at how this gets perceived. And of course, as Sarah said, this is something you would, normally be seen as heartwarming, and is on the, on the nightly news. And there have even been stories recently on nightly news about other situations like this, even as of this year, and that have made national news. But what is complicated about this specific story is that in this situation, they were ahead, I believe, by 30 some odd points, to the point where when they included him on the team, it was a last minute addition to have him be on and to have him shoot the basket, because they didn't really, they did not care about the idea that he could be able to play the entire game, because they're like, okay, we already have this many points, we're going to be in a lead, so what's the matter with having them there? Now, that might be a really nice gesture, but it is kind of an act of charity and doesn't really have the idea of inclusion, because they're making the assumption that he's not going to do well in the first place, because they're saying, okay, why put him in the game? Why take the risk of putting him in the game if he isn't good enough to be in the game? And then, wow, what a surprise, he does as well as he does. And that brings into an interesting point of, that disabled folks aren't here to inspire non-disabled people. And what's important about that is there's a distinction to be made, because I don't want to say that all inspiration is ever completely bad, because I chose to be an advocate to hopefully inspire people in the autistic community, to help give them a sense of self-determination for what they can do, of who they can be, to help give them resources and give them a role model that can, be able to straddle that line where I can have friends who are neurotypical and autistic, but still be true to myself. But I made that choice out of my own will. And I think with a story like this, we're putting people up on pedestals and saying, you are inspiring all of us to do better and do good, when those challenges aren't necessarily analogous. When him as an autistic person maybe is dealing with a lot of challenges that might not be the same as ones that normal people, neurotypical people deal with. And that can be really heart-wrenching for an autistic person to be pushed into that place and be put up on that pedestal when really they may not want to be for themselves. And so it's okay to allow people to be inspiring, to allow autistic people to choose to put themselves in that place to help people, but doing that out of sort of, again, charity, without, and seeing that it isn't a miracle or magic, but seeing it as, why did this person get to that place? What inspired them to do what they do, and taking it as, this is a person who is doing really good for themselves, not being someone who should be put up again on that pedestal to say, oh, they're inspiring all of us to do all this good. And so that is, again, this negative framing of, if this person has a disability, then, we're going to be surprised by all of this and think, oh, we did such a great job as a community lifting this person up, when they did a good job completely on their own doing that. And you have to give them the credit for that, rather than saying, look at this community, look at how inspiring this is such a miracle, this is magical, stuff like that. Even if the intention is good, even if it's good to look at autistic people and say, look at what they can accomplish, it has to be done through their own lens and made by their own choices. Do you have any thoughts on that, Sarah?
I think you've got it exactly right. While I think that the intention of the story was, of course, good, I think that everyone wants to see a story like that. It comes off as charity to me. And, there's a lot of disagreement even about this point within the disabled community. I wouldn't be surprised if another member of the disabled community would feel really heartwarmed, like feel really good when they saw this story. So it's not a black and white issue. But ultimately, if we're looking at it through like an advocacy lens, it's not exactly what I would want to see, and it doesn't come off as heartwarming to me. Though I am happy that he is a great basketball player. I just wish he was in for the rest of the game and it wasn't a last 4 minutes thing. So back to our general agenda, we're now moving into the third part of the presentation, which is on ableism. What is ableism? The definition of ableism is discrimination in favor of able-bodied people. So that is discrimination that kind of oppresses disabled people in society. Okay, we know the definition, but what does that actually look like? Because sometimes it's not always that easy to see when it happens in the moment. So Thomas and I will both be going over some of our personal experiences with ableism, because again, we are just one segment of the disabled population. These experiences aren't necessarily contiguous with every single person within the disabled community. So we're going to draw from our own experience in order to be able to speak most accurately. I would say that there are some blatant examples, and I would say the most blatant example would be refusing to write a letter of recommendation based on my unpredictability. And again, my unpredictability was because I went to the hospital and because I needed medical attention. And because of that, I was rejected from a letter of recommendation that I would have benefited from going into college. There are also some unintentional and covert examples that are more common. It's really not as common to see blatant examples, but unintentional and covert examples are honestly encountered almost on the daily for me. So one example is firm deadlines on work and assignments. Disability is not linear and it's not constant. Disability can take many shapes and forms. Some days I'll have a really great memory and I'll be able to remember yesterday. Some days I can't really get out of bed because I will almost pass out every time I get out of bed. So some days I can get a lot of work done and I can function almost like everyone else in society, and other days I can't. So putting firm deadlines on work and assignments can be somewhat ableist sometimes, especially when it's in an individual kind of like, if we're talking about it in the realm of STEM, if we are, if I am a member of a lab and there's a firm deadline, that can sometimes be prohibitive to me. The second kind of example of ableism is questioning if a person's actually disabled, which it might sound weird, but it actually happens a lot of the time, where a lot of our internal thoughts are saying, okay, but does this person really need to take the elevator, or can they like just take the stairs? Because it would save a lot of time. Or saying, is that person autistic? Because like, I couldn't really tell. Get that a lot. Or you don't look autistic. That's another example of ableism. There is no look to autism. And second, there is no really line between autistic and not autistic. A third example would be a lack of virtual options. Virtual options can be more accessible to a lot of disabled people. Again, if I can't really walk somewhere if I'm having trouble with my heart condition and I can't really walk all the way to campus, it can be somewhat prohibitive. So having something as simple as recording the class or putting it on Zoom can increase accessibility vastly. Long lectures and meetings without breaks. This is something that would benefit basically everyone. It's an accommodation that most benefits people with attentional difficulties or different memory issues, and they can take that break to write notes about what happened or review their notes. But it also benefits everyone who may not be disabled. A lot of people struggle to sit through a meeting. So accommodations benefit not only the disabled community, but they also benefit the able-bodied community. Standing only events like conferences, those are really difficult for me. Standing for long periods of time is really uncomfortable for me. I start to get like a little bit faint in my head. Sensory wise with my autism, standing for long periods of time, just sensory wise, isn't really great for me. I get to really antsy, and a lot of conferences, like scientific conferences, tend to be standing room only for poster presentations and stuff like that. And a final example that I'll give is assuming that when I'm wearing my headphones, I'm being rude. Last year, I was on an RU experience, and for those who are not familiar, it's a undergraduate research experience that's kind of a summer internship. And at the end of the summer, we had to present our research at a mini conference on the campus. And it was very loud and echoey in that room. And if you're expecting me to present at a conference, it's not going to be possible. So I put on my headphones and I presented with my headphones on. And a lot of the professors were saying, it's really rude that you have your headphones on right now. And again, they didn't really know that I'm disabled, but they shouldn't have to know at the same time. I shouldn't have to disclose my disability for them to treat me with respect. So kind of, those are some of the examples I have, and I'll pass it on to Thomas.
You did a great job, by the way, of that, Sarah, of trying to look through the complexities of what is considered blatant and what's more common. And one of the things I want to sort of emphasize of that before I get into mine is, I know that for people who might be looking at sort of, the internalized sort of ableism versus not, blatant versus more common examples, it can be very kind of daunting, because you're looking saying, oh God, are there cases where I might have said something and didn't mean it, even though maybe my intention was good in some ways. And that can be a lot to emotionally wrestle with, but that doesn't mean that we can't do better and we can't improve. We wouldn't be here speaking to, on behalf of this community to you if we didn't think that it was valuable for people to learn, and we didn't think it was possible for people to learn how to see, okay, maybe this isn't the best way of thinking about this, and this is what gets more complicated about it. So I wanted to bring that in. It can be terrifying. It can be a lot to think about, because, some of it is a lot of it is unintentional, but it is a matter of changing those societal perceptions over the long term to make it to where people with disabilities can be accepted. So sort of for my own sake, I split up into two different sectors, because a lot of where I had difficulties with ableism came much more early on in my life before I got into college. But I think these things are pertinent, especially for those who, let's say, would be working with children. If we were talking about the Leaky pipeline earlier, if we want to help people with disabilities and give them the resources they need, we can't just start in the college era. We have to continue to go through the entirety of the lifespan, beforehand and after. And so for me, a lot of the ableism I experienced was much more in public education before college. So first of it being that, for those who don't know me very well, I was diagnosed initially at the age of 18 months, and I was nonverbal. And the way that doctors and clinicians and people talked, there was this presumption that I would be nonverbal for the rest of my life, and I would be put into an institution, which is crazy to think that that was said in 2001. This wasn't back in the 60s and 70s. This was within this millennium, which is insane to think about. So there's a lot of this assuming of what are the skills that I can do and can't do. And that can end up setting negative expectations for it, and it set up difficult expectations for my parents. And they luckily pushed against that and said, we're not going to take this. We're going to do what we want to do for our son and give him the resources he needs. But a lot of people get discouraged by that, and then that ends up, those children don't get the resources they need, and then they end up not being able to pursue the things that they want. And so that is something I've definitely experienced. And even when I got to the point where I could be verbal and do well, there was this assumption of and constant evaluation about how autistic enough I would be to get resources, where if I am not to a specific threshold in terms of my disability, then I'm not able to get the resources I need. And so there was a constant tug and pull in the school of what resources I needed, what ones I didn't. And there was even a point at the age of 13 where they're like, his autism doesn't really matter for education. And so my parents had to fight and say, no, we're going to give him these resources because he needs these and they're important. And you can't just take him away just because he doesn't look autistic anymore. He's still autistic. And so the next piece with that is pushing to conform to more neurotypical social norms. And for that, a lot of that was one of the common traits that autistic people have is what we call self-stimulatory behavior, or stimming, which you might know better as the rocking back and forth, flapping hands, a lot of the sort of movements, which can be really useful and lovely, especially in trying to express emotions or trying to deal with sensory difficulties. But a lot of the idea is that you can't do that because it's seen as either unprofessional or rude in the adult world, or in the child world, it's because it won't help them pay attention as well. So you have to suppress that. And so I had to deal with people suppressing stims. I had to deal with, people telling me that I had to talk a certain way, as a person, that I had to go through a specific social script of how to speak to people. And that's a really harmful thing to teach a child who is trying their hardest to just exist and be as good as they can be in their school setting, if they were just allowed to speak the way they could and be able to express themselves in that way and have that nurtured, they could be able to do really well. Similar to Sarah, I've had difficulties with sensory situations, especially when I'm emotionally overwhelmed. It can be, my senses can start to get really heightened, and it can be a place where I feel like light and sound and all those things can get really agitating. And there have been teachers who have said, you can't have your head down because you're not paying attention. I'm trying to express to them, it's not that I'm not paying attention, it's that I can't concentrate if I don't block out all of the sensory stuff that's going on. And so that was a big deal for sure in a lot of situations, especially when I was really emotionally agitated, which I was a lot because of a lot of bullying that happened when I was younger. And then even just something as simple as students who bully and who try to push down people who with disabilities because they're different, and people refusing to explain to them why their bullying was wrong or why bullying of other people was wrong, because they chalk up neurotypical people to do it, to be like, oh, these kids are just kids, they'll do this to each other, it's just light teasing. But then with other people with disabilities, if they're the ones on the other end, there isn't really a defense to really help them not be subject to that kind of ridicule. And so because they're trying to see it as a normative thing of, oh, this is just the way kids act, when really this isn't right to have kids bully other people. It isn't right to do those sorts of things and to teach children that they can bully people because they're different, or can bully others because they're associated with people that are different. That's a thing that happened to me as well, with friends and people who knew me. They were teased because they knew me, and then they didn't want to be around me when the teachers could just explain, oh, this isn't the right way to talk to this kid, and to treat people. And so I dealt with a lot of that. In college, I was luckier because I was able to be in an environment where I could be around people in the autism sphere, because I was studying autism, and so I was around people who were already pretty aware. But even then, in this field, I have dealt with this on a regular basis. One of which being whenever I've advocated either for myself and my own interests as a student, or have advocated for other students, even non-disabled students, when it comes to, let's say, mistakes in grading or other things like that. I try to be professional, but I also am very firm in what I think is fair and unfair. And I try to not let the professor and the authority get in the way of saying what I think is right. And some people think of that as being rude and disrespectful and just being too pushing against authority. But for me, I'm not being unprofessional or disrespectful. I'm trying to advocate for what these interests are. And if someone could tell me what that is that's actually being rude, beyond that I'm talking up to an authority figure when I think they're doing something wrong that is important and I can prove it, then if they can't do that, then they're just doing it because of, again, that perception of autistic people are rude or difficult or too honest. And then the second one that I've really experienced, and this might be not as applicable to STEM, but maybe in some degrees it might be, not having enough representation of viewpoints in teaching who are disabled, at least in the field I work in. There aren't a lot of autistic people who get to advocate and talk through their viewpoints. And so a lot of the narrative is driven by non-autistic people and their more medical model view of autism and trying to remediate or treat it in a certain way. And so it felt very uncomfortable being around a lot of people who didn't have these viewpoints or these understandings and being like, where can I put my viewpoint into this? How can I feel like what I'm being said is, or what I'm saying is being heard by people? And that can be really discouraging when you're working in a field of advocacy where you're trying to help a community, but you're around people who are trying to help the same community, but have a diametrically opposed view that comes from their own, but not really from the community itself. And so all of those tie into this ableism and this difficulty in saying autistic people or people with disabilities in general have to accommodate and have to do all this legwork and try to do all these things in order to succeed, when really it should be people in power and authority who are non-disabled who should be giving those resources back to the communities, because they deserve as much for themselves and they deserve that representation for themselves. And so if you have any other thoughts to add, please tell me, Sarah.
I completely agree. And I especially relate to your point about social perception and advocacy situations. I've definitely had people say like, oh, that was really abrupt, or that was really straightforward, and kind of comment on my way of speaking. And then that led to a little bit of what's called internalized ableism, or me internalizing things that other people say, and then my own thoughts are kind of what they said to me. So now when I, speak, I'm constantly checking, okay, am I being too autistic? Which is a really big point that we're going to bring up, I think, later. So we've made it to the Q&A, which is wonderful.
Yay.
Yay. So now it is time for participants to ask questions. I'll stop sharing my screen so that we can all see each other. Oh my goodness, look at us all. There's many people. So please, if you have a question, you can either speak up or you can write it in the chat.
I have a question. So what are your opinions on self-diagnosis of various disabilities?
Ooh, that is a really fascinating one. If I can take the lead on this, Sarah. This is something I've talked about a lot, specifically in the autism community. And this is going to be something to every community, of course. Sorry, I'm trying to get through. There we go. I can see everybody now. Hi. This is something that is not applicable to every community necessarily, because there are always going to be complexities in how things are diagnosed. For instance, of course, you have more medical conditions where you have people who have this expertise in, let's say, like, for instance, Sarah's mentioning her heart condition, where there is this sense of, okay, we need the medical professionals, we need people with this kind of expertise to be able to have it, that are more on the objective end, physically speaking. But when it comes to mental and intellectual developmental disabilities, it becomes a more complicated situation, because it's all, again, biased by how people diagnose. And so, for instance, to talk through the autism piece, I was lucky, again, that I was diagnosed as early on as I was. Part of that, though, is because I am a Caucasian male. And a lot of people of different genders and backgrounds do not get diagnosed as early or as often, mainly because there's a specific societal perception about how autism is diagnosed. And so you get to this sort of complicated piece where, for instance, women and people of color and other communities may express their autism differently, because autism, being a social diagnosis, is going to change based on culture, identity, gender, lots of different pieces. And that makes it to where if somebody has a tool that is not normed for those populations, which many of the autistic diagnosis tools are not based on, other intersecting communities, a lot of people then get lost in the shuffle and then don't get a diagnosis until later. What's then also complicated is, for instance, with autism, some of the ideas of being autistic and how that gets diagnosed are behavioral related. So you have to You have to sort of express your autism in a certain way and see it as, see it as expressing it in, whether it be specific differences with nonverbal cues or other social cues, or again, the sensory difficulties, things like that. And if you don't express those in the same way, you might not get a diagnosis. The double-edged sword is that a lot of autistic people end up, because of the stigma that is around autism, having to push their autism internally and say, oh, I have to blend in and camouflage and not come across as autistic in the way that I present, because if I do that, I'll get more opportunities, and if I don't, I'll be rejected. So people will then camouflage for a long time, not knowing they're autistic, and then not get a diagnosis until they really acknowledge, hey, I'm autistic, this is a part of my identity. And that's where self-diagnosis can actually be really helpful, because people who have their own experiences and can report on those, which has been proven in research that autistic people can absolutely self-report and be able to look at their own aspects of who they are and what their diagnosis is, that using those to be able to say maybe this person is part of the community until they get a diagnosis proper could actually be really valuable and really powerful for people in that community. And so I would say, yes, absolutely. Self-diagnosis is not a universal piece, of course, but in certain cases, it can be incredibly valuable for autistic people to be able to see who they are. And of course, for other diagnoses, whether it be ADHD, OCD, lots of other neurodevelopmental differences. What are your thoughts on that, Sarah? Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I completely agree, because as someone who was labeled female at birth, I didn't receive a diagnosis early. I received my diagnosis at 20. And I think that that's a lot to do with how much masking or camouflaging I was taught to do in order to kind of seem normal. So there's one question in the chat that says, what is your take on those who were diagnosed late in life or had a family unit that did not advocate? So as someone who was diagnosed late in life, I resonate with that question. And ultimately, it can be challenging to be someone who was diagnosed late in life, because it would have taught me so much about myself. I've always known that I'm different, but I never had a word to describe it. And I never had necessarily any accommodations to accommodate from any of the difficulties I may have had. And it's not that my family unit didn't advocate. I think it was more of a decision that was saying, well, Sarah's doing fine in school and fine and really well. And maybe that's good enough. And maybe because they are doing so well in school, they don't really need a diagnosis. And that's a decision that was made. And ultimately it's one that I wish could be undone in a way. And I wish that I, had a diagnosis earlier on, but ultimately it is a valid decision that a lot of families make. I also see another question in the chat that says, I have professors justify not offering recordings and virtual options by stating that people who don't need accommodations would take advantage of them. I have always struggled to have a response to that. So I would love to answer this, which is, how are we defining taking advantage? Is it that the professor maybe doesn't want low attendance in class and wants a larger class where there's a more fruitful discussion, which is a very valid thing, but ultimately, why are those students not attending in the first place that don't have disabilities? Is it because they had a really rough day and they just can't make it? Or is it because they don't want to wake up at 9 a.m.? Do they learn better later in the day rather than at 9 a.m.? Is it a personal learning style? So it can be a little bit complicated. I don't know if Thomas has any kind of thoughts to add to that.
I love that question immensely, and I really appreciate that, because I've actually had that experience as well. This is not actually, I realized I didn't even put this in the presentation. This is actually a perfect place to put it. I actually had an experience at one point where a student, so I have a backstory, sorry. I have early registration accommodations that I had in undergrad, because as anyone who knows who's been through undergrad at U of R, the registration system is absolutely insane, and it can be very anxiety inducing. and it's a very quick system because you have to move incredibly, incredibly quickly in order to get slots for classes. And it's what messed up my first semester of undergrad. Now, I don't regret that one bit because I got classes that I end up loving, but of course, at first it was really devastating. And when I asked for early accommodations and I said, hey, I have difficulty with processing speed, especially computer-wise, and trying to do the registration, I don't know if it's fair for me to have this. I was very lucky that they gave me the accommodation. I had a student tell me that I was taking advantage of the system and that other people would take advantage of that system. And I said, well, even if it's the case that isn't, again, it comes from this sort of idea of things are a meritocracy where you have to work hard and it has to be about this matter of luck and equality in order to do this. But the real equity is giving people the resources they need so that everyone can be where they need to be and get to do the classes that they can do, of course, within reason. Because should we even have a system to begin with that makes it super fast for people to have to click through classes and completely rush through the anxiety-inducing process of getting through all of those classes and having to do the registration and have it be incredibly competitive, especially for freshmen? Should we even have that to begin with? So why are people criticizing me and other people for taking advantage of a system that is in itself unfair to begin with? And why do other people just accept that that's what it is? And so I think that, and so it's sort of a, it's sort of a don't hate the player, hate the game kind of thing, where it's not us who are doing anything wrong. It's looking at why is the system the way it is and how can we construct a better one. And so I relate with that in my own experiences because I've been told about taking advantage, which again comes from the idea of, oh, I'm not disabled enough to be able to have that accommodation. Well, do you know me? Have you seen me? Do you know my experiences every day? And those people very often don't.
Great. We have another question in the chat, which says, what possible initiatives do you think an institution could do for its students so that speaking to professionals and getting the proper accommodations is less stigmatized? Thomas, do you have any thoughts on this?
Ooh, oh my goodness, this is such a great question. I think part of it has to come from the individual mindsets of the people you're working with, because yes, there are policies and things we could look at in terms of giving more open access to resources, to allowing people to have connections for evaluations and things. But let's say someone is a student and they're going to, and I hope this is a good answer to the question, please tell me if I'm wrong. And I interrupt myself a lot. If you can't tell, I'm sorry. But let's say you're a student trying to work through your accommodations, trying to figure out what kind of resources you need. Let's say, again, let's say a late diagnosed autistic person, they might think, they might want to go to a professor, go to somebody to do that. Maybe as a professor, as a professional, being able to be open to that and saying, okay, what resources can I find? How can I be helpful in that process? And let's say, even if you don't know people who you can connect with, who can do evaluations and help that process, maybe just being there to, again, give those accommodations and listen and say, okay, how can I be here to help? What can I do to make that process easier? Can make it less stigmatizing for the individual. Again, it's that internalized ableism that Sarah was talking about, that feeling of, am I autistic enough or am I not autistic enough in order to get these resources? If that professor, that person takes the first step to say, oh, to make it less stigmatizing in their own right, that can give that person the gumption to feel like, okay, maybe this is something that could be helpful. Maybe other professionals might be, and maybe it might turn out that that professor could reach out to people and have no other resources in the area that could help that person get evaluated and things like that. So a lot of it does come down to culture and the way that we talk about things and about individuals, because as much as we could talk about systems and talk about these ideas and those structures, and those are practically speaking important, a lot of it's rooted in culture. A lot of it is rooted in how we see disability. And so we have to start with ourselves and say, what can we do? How can we help the people, again, in front of us? Because we can help people all across the world, but the people we're going to be working with are in front of us right now. And they're the ones in front of us, and they're the ones who need our help. And so what can we do for that person in that moment to help things be less stigmatizing for them? But I was also not late diagnosed, and so I'd love to hear, Sarah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because you might have a better idea of this piece.
Yeah, it's a complicated question. Stigmatization of accommodations is big, and ultimately, I think in order to get less stigmatized I think going back to what Thomas says, it's important for professors to really take a big role in that and to ask their students, do you need accommodations? And to advertise accommodations and say, make a statement in their syllabus, say that accommodations are for equity, and yeah, have professionals in the field kind of take the lead on that, because where is that stigmatization coming from? For me, that stigmatization is coming from professionals in the field, or like career professionals, where I'm concerned about, well, if I'm taking accommodations, will that make me a less good scientist? Or will, my PIs think less of me because I have accommodations? So that thought of like internalized ableism is always coming from professionals or people above me. So the most important people we can get to change the stigma is the people who have, who have power, in that they're able-bodied and that they have an education. That leads us to our next question, which is kind of similar, and I would love to take a stab at it. The question says, is it okay to ask someone what their disability is? Complicated question. And I know that there's probably PIs out there that their student set has accommodations, or a professor that, that has students that have accommodations, and they're told, because of privacy reasons, don't ask the student what their disability is. And that's can be really great for something that is less personable, like a professor and student relationship, where a professor is teaching a class and a student is in the class, and they maybe don't have too much contact with each other. But for something like a graduate student joining a lab, where that contact is going to be prolonged, it's going to be for 5 or 6 years, and they're going to, get to know each other really well. I would say that it is okay to ask what someone's disability is, if you know that person enough. It's not your first time meeting, but if you feel comfortable enough and you say, hey, totally okay to not answer this question, but if you feel comfortable and if you think it will benefit for you, I would love to hear what accommodations might be helpful for you. And by asking in terms of accommodations, the student can then share, okay, these are the accommodations I want. Oh, and by the way, if they feel comfortable, they can then share their disability. So it's a matter of, it's kind of walking that line of, do we feel comfortable in that conversation? And also, protecting the student's privacy. But personally, if I had a PI and I had mentioned that I'm disabled, I would love for them to ask what my disability is, because that means that PI is comfortable talking about disability in general. And it makes me feel like there's less stigma in the lab, and it makes me feel more comfortable in general. Thomas, do you have 2 minutes to answer?
Yes, I can interject with the last little bit. I'm not trying to take over the last word, but I'll just say super quick. I did see Linda's point in the chat talking about they're not, legally permitted to ask, but if someone discloses, it does change things, which is true. What I think is interesting, and I actually think would be a really good solution to that, is whenever people join into any kind of lab or given setting, especially for prolonged periods, asking people, not just disabled people, but people who are non-disabled, what kind of things do you need? What resources would be helpful? Because if you can make it a universal thing of people all need resources, because that's true, we all need resources, we all need things that are important to us, then you can kind of get the ball rolling of people being more open to saying, okay, maybe I need these things, maybe I need these resources. And then someone who has a disability could then sort of more freely disclose and say, hey, I have this, could we be able to work through this? But you can't open that door if you don't offer the accommodations to begin with and make it really, really clear that those accommodations are there. Now, obviously here we do have accommodations and people talk about the idea of accommodations, but I don't think they're emphasized enough for what that actually is. And so I think a professor's job is to say, hey, I want to make perfectly clear, if you need accommodations, tell me. We will work through something. It doesn't matter if it's a class of 5 or it's a class of 150. We all need accommodations. We all need certain supports, and being able to have that emphasized could make people with disabilities and people who don't have disabilities much more welcome in the class once that's really emphasized. And that's all, again, about creating a better culture and an environment, which is the professor and the faculty's job to be able to do. And this, of course, in a lab as well, especially.
Yeah. In conclusion, I think that the correct way to go about it is to, in your first meeting, say, hey, by the way, I'm a professor who believes in disability justice. And if this resonates with you in any way, I'm someone who would love to accommodate you in any way. And that might be the way to go about it. And if they feel comfortable sharing, which hopefully they would be, then they can go about sharing. So I do have to keep this webinar to 7 o'clock. And yeah, so thank you all for coming, and we'll see you hopefully in 2 weeks.
Thank you so much,
Bye.
everybody. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.